Welcome you to this 2014 session of FSI and of ICNC. And I want to express my continuing pleasure in working in this summer school and in trying to continue to present civil resistance, nonviolent civil resistance as a force more powerful, but also as an idea whose time has come. And I recognize very clearly that the way we, at least in Western civilization, are pushing the sale of bombs and guns and the exploitation of military strategies, that soon the human family will be faced with the decision as to whether or not we're going to continue to go the route of spreading violence in all sorts of forms, and especially militarized and war, the most organized form of violence in history. If we're going to go that route, or we're going to find a way to turn our resources, our energy, our ideas towards how the human family can resolve the issues of poverty and inequality and violence, and create nations and villages and societies where indeed the full potential of human life can be tapped, as it has not been tapped in the last 100 years and is not being tapped today by the policies and practices of the nations around the world for the most part. Nonviolent struggle, it seems to me, is the only way that anywhere in the world you and I can create and establish struggles that have the possibility of effecting the kinds of change that represents the true aspirations of people everywhere. One of the reasons I am glad that I was born in Pennsylvania, Uniontown, Pennsylvania, in the United States, is because along the way I've met the notion that this United States of America had a very unique beginning in a sea of national governments that were basically rooted in aristocracy and kings and queens, and the right of the rich and the powerful to dominate all facets of life. This government began with the notion, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all are created equal, and that all are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I love the fact that that idea was one of the most radical things that had ever happened in human history. But it wasn't just an idea. It was rather, in fact, a fair number of the settlers in the 13 colonies who claimed that they should be able to govern themselves, that government should be indeed organized by the people and for the people at every moment. Now, it has to be said that that radical notion, political, social, spiritual, moral, at the same time, had huge obstacles. For one thing, we discovered this very spacious land, and I can recall when in high school the history books said it wasn't populated by very many people. It was mostly empty. Though anthropologists and others say that there were perhaps on it's the portion that forms the United States and North America, there were probably 13 to 15 million people living. But we found this spacious land, and we wanted the land. So basically, we took it from the indigenous people, quite in contradiction to the idealism that was apparent. In order to cultivate the land and develop the land, we imported, along with European trade, European nations that had started slavery, or were using slavery, and African slavery in particular. We imported slaves from Africa. In the 17th century, 1619, in fact. And so that began a major obstacle to this idea of we the people. So that major obstacles, these obstacles ran up against the Civil War, a history that said it must change. And so slavery ended legally in 1865. But by that time, the virus of racism had begun, first against the indigenous people who were found here, against women. We hung women and burned women as witches in New England area, as an example. And then against, of course, black people, the African peoples. And so that produced, after the Civil War, no national will to end the poison of slavery and the economic inequalities of slavery. And so, especially in the southeastern states and colonies, black codes took place. There are books now being published almost every year on the study of the violence in the city of Memphis, as an example, where in fact hundreds of black people who were skilled work people were denied the right of making a living for themselves off the plantations. And so one historian says that 130,000 black people were shot and killed in the years from around 1870 to 1910. That imposed, therefore, segregation by law in many parts of our land, by custom, by teaching, and the rest of it. And so public segregation and the immoral idea that people had the right to establish a skating rink and then put a sign up saying, "No Jew allowed in the skating rink," or "No dirty Irish" were part of the signs around the Boston area in 1950, 1960. And I'm still puzzled by the fact that as I grew up seeing some of these signs and knowing this condition in the United States, there was no moral outrage. So in Nashville, Tennessee, you had drinking fountains marked white only, colored only. You had restrooms marked sometimes white gentlemen, white ladies, and then a common restroom marked for colored only. Nashville had no law decreeing this form. Alabama did. But in any case, we're talking about a scene in the 1950s where, while there was great anger among some of us, nevertheless, no strategy was developed to begin the process of changing that form of public segregation and animosity. And so, as I traveled around the South as a secretary for Fellowship of Reconciliation, I met many different kinds of people in Little Rock, Arkansas, in Jackson, Mississippi, in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in St. Augustine, Florida, in Birmingham, Alabama. I went to many of the places where there had been bombing and crises. The Alexander Luby's home bombed in Nashville was not the first bombing in Nashville. In 1957, September, a school was bombed in Nashville as desegregation of schools began. In East Tennessee, Clinton in '57, another school was bombed in the same fashion. So it wasn't the first bombing in Nashville at all. As I traveled, it seemed to me a key issue, and an issue that Martin King talked about and other people talked about, was the question of what next. Was the Montgomery bus boycott an accident? Can it happen again? Various developments took place between 55, 56, 60. But the Nashville movement began when, in the course of action, I decided that if I wanted to see a major campaign take place, I would have to do it myself. So I told the people in New York at the FOR that I was going to give more attention to what could happen in Nashville. And I was fortunate because there were people in Nashville who thought the Montgomery bus boycott was the best thing that had ever happened. And they thought it was a model. They wanted to know, how do you repeat this model? So you saw some of their pictures in the film itself. And I began to talk to them, let's do it here. And they were in total agreement. So June of 1958, we met in Saturday morning workshops at various churches around Nashville. 99% of us were blacks of Nashville. And we used deliberately the first Gandhian step. I called it focus. Gandhi called it investigation. We examined the plight of the Negro in Nashville. We had long lists of issues that were put together. I wish I had saved some of those minutes. Maybe I did, and have lost them somewhere along the way. But we examined every facet of black life from the point of view of the segregation, the hurt, the brokenness, the lack of access to opportunity, the lack of being able to take jobs for which people were qualified, and the rest of it. And from April, May, and June, we discussed, sometimes very heated discussions, can we do it, and what should we do? And the decision was made then, by June, that we would begin a campaign in the fall of 1959 to desegregate public life. This is more important than what most people in the United States understand, because up to this time, the primary strategy, if we can call it that, of what's called the civil rights movement was school desegregation and or desegregating the Constitution of the United States by court decisions. Those were the two major aims. Other things were going on in the entertainment world and the sports world. Those were not in many ways organized from the point of view of black organizations and leadership in the country. So that decision on the part of about 60 people in Nashville set a different strategy. And that strategy was desegregate public life. That's where people were really hurting. And I could talk about this for some time because I learned much about why it was so important. And I have to tell you that I did not know what to do. And I was fortunate that this group of people were willing to wrestle and talk and be angry with one another, and even sometimes shout and scream at each other. But in the final determination, it was decided we will do a nonviolent campaign to desegregate public life in the city of Nashville. We said downtown Nashville. And so I worked on a plan of strategy and all for the summer, and we agreed we would begin recruiting people for a series of intense workshops that would help people to really grab hold of this notion of how you fight through, in fact, not imitating the opponent, but finding other ways of working to make changes. And so we laid out a strategy of a sit-in campaign, sit-ins first, then economic boycott, poster walks, mass meetings, and we proceeded to recruit people for those workshops. It gave a shot to the whole movement. It basically reiterated what had happened in Montgomery, Alabama. At the same moment, it's trained and prepared all sorts of people who became, in many ways, the shock troops and the staff people for about the next decade around the southeastern part of the country, but also in other parts of the country as well. It became, in King's word, a model movement, and it became the way then the Albany movement was organized. It became the way that then the Birmingham campaign was organized in 1963. It became the way the 1964 St. Augustine, Florida campaign was organized. It became the model way of doing the work of desegregating public life. This is the 50th year of the Civil Rights Bill of the United States, passed in 1964. That Civil Rights Bill made that kind of public segregation illegal. Now, it's interesting that while the Congress and the President passed that law, they didn't put any enforcement agencies behind it. So while it remains the law of the land, public segregation is officially illegal in the United States for the first time. It should be all, as of 1964, it should also be said that discrimination in employment was made a part of that Civil Rights Bill, so that the nation for the first time passed a law, again, without an enforcement agency, that makes discrimination in employment by virtue of color or gender or national origin or religion unconstitutional. It's still there. A lot of celebrations going on about that 1964 bill. And it was heroic, but it was a consequence of what I call the emerging nonviolent direct action campaign of the civil rights movement. Because I maintained that the nonviolent direct action was the radical action, where we put our bodies on the streets, in the stores, and many other places, sometimes also in the jails, but where fundamentally we convinced a sizable number of people in this country that the day of segregation was over. And millions of people withdrew their consent. And I want here just quickly to add that a campaign to change injustice in your community and society cannot be a one-generation affair. I list some 20 years of major nonviolent events in the United States from 1953 to 1973, and one can do more than that. Not only major events, but then supporting events across the country. The FBI has kept numbers in some cases, 1,700 demonstrations of one kind or another in 1963 around in connection with the Montgomery bus boycott. But the point I simply make to you is that this Nashville campaign, which I had never organized such a campaign before and did not know how to do it, but my study and knowledge and experimentation personally convinced me that nonviolent struggle could make a difference in the United States. And as an accumulative force, 4 or 5 years, 1960, of action. It helped to spread the sensibility that Montgomery bus boycott was not an accident, that people could put their minds and hearts and bodies together around strategic concerns. We could change the United States. Now, in 1961, there was a thing called the Freedom Ride. It represented 16 people only who were to travel in a desegregated fashion down the coast of the Atlantic Ocean, the east coast of America, into South Carolina, then Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, into Louisiana and New Orleans. I did not help to plan that. I did support the fact that the Congress of Racial Equality did it. I wasn't too sure about how much of the strategizing they had done, but it was a good event. But when it hit Alabama, a bus was burned, and then in Birmingham, Alabama, the police and the Ku Klux Klan and the White Citizens Council, with the knowledge of our FBI, conspired so that the bus in Birmingham was vigorously attacked by a white mob and people bruised and beaten in various ways. And the bus, 16 or so riders on the Freedom Ride of 1961 were so bruised that they flew from Birmingham to New Orleans, declaring the ride over. Now, because of our work in Nashville, we in Nashville said we could not allow a burning bus to stop the legitimate right of American people to demonstrate or to assemble in a peaceful way to protest and resist wrong. And that's the way some of us put it. Because in Nashville we taught the idea, if the opponents begin to heap violence, jail, suffering on you, then you have to step back from it for a while if necessary and figure out what's going on. Then you have to figure out strategies by which you can then move through it or over it or under it, expand and escalate the movement until you can make the changes that need to be made. And so when the Freedom Ride was canceled in Birmingham, Alabama, not through any intention on the part of anyone, we in Nashville made a hard decision that we would pick up the ride and we would continue it. So as a consequence of that, then Congress of Racial Equality, SNCC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, came back into the ride at our push. And so the Freedom Ride then moved from Birmingham to Montgomery, Alabama to Jackson, where we discovered much later that the Kennedy administration had made a decision to allow the governor of Mississippi, Ross Barnett, to arrest us in Jackson, Mississippi, but also then to protect us in arresting us from the white mobs of Mississippi. And so that meant that over 400 of us ended up in Jackson jails and then in the penitentiary of the state of Mississippi. But the net result was that picking up of the Freedom Ride, out of, in fact, the sensibility of our struggle in Nashville, caused that Freedom Ride then to become an explosive, dynamic demonstration that helped to move literally millions of people in the country, but many black people in the South and Southeast, to continuing action. And so the Freedom Ride was followed by the Albany movement, then by the Birmingham movement, so forth and so on. The point I would quickly end with is this, that while I had never planned this kind of a program or campaign before, by following a simple process, working with people in the community who want to change, and working until we came to a consensus and a target, and then doing intensive preparation of nonviolence from its history, from its tactics across the ages, we were able to see this nonviolent struggle in America expand beyond any imagination by anyone. What I would therefore try to point out to you, one, is that the notion of nonviolent struggle is an ancient concept. I suggest to you the document by Gene Sharp, The Politics of Nonviolent Action, where Gene spent some 25 or 30 years researching tactics of nonviolence from around the world and across human history, and lists some 198 tactics in that book. So it's an old tactic and idea. But it really has never gotten very much into the history books of the world, even though, as the Force More Powerful book and videos demonstrate, in the 20th century, it was used in every decade, in every continent, by millions of people to produce new beginnings on the part of peoples in many different countries. Gandhi coined the term nonviolence in his South Africa campaigns. He did not like the word pacifism. He did not like the word passive resistance. He did not like the idea of cowardliness, flight from the turmoil of the struggle. And he coined the term nonviolence as a 20th century concept. But it gathers a noble experience on the part of the human family. And what ICNC is doing, and what others of us are doing as well, in teaching, in work at the academic level, at the research and the like, we know that given the experience of the human race, maybe across 4,000 or 5,000 years of our history, given the experience of the human race, given the wisdom that the future of the race does not rest in the way in which the nations of the earth, for the most part, are organized, whether in the Ukraine or in the Congo or in the United States. We know that the wave of the future is to reach back and pull the ancient wisdom of our own human race and begin to codify it and classify it, begin to make it a subject of academic resources, gather the evidence that is clear around the world, and make it not only a source for people in a personal fashion to change the very climate of their own scene, but to also work with others in such a way that they can turn their scenery away from violence and war and division and hatred and inequality and begin the steps by which we can see a very different world, a different kind of world come about. I'm personally persuaded that in the United States in the 21st century, there are going to be campaigns of nonviolent struggle such as the world has never seen, such as we in the United States have not seen. And I am convinced that through that, even my own country has not yet reached the goals of a society where all are created equal, but that it is the worthwhile goal for my country and for yours.